Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. We're here with Todd Zywicki today talking about a new volume he has co-edited with Neal McCluskey entitled Unprofitable Schooling, Examining Causes of and Fixes for America's Broken Ivory Tower. I'm glad to welcome Todd Zywicki back to Liberty Law Talk. It's been a few years. Todd is the George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. He's the former executive director at the George Mason Law and Economics Center. He's published numerous papers, essays, reviews. He's a commentator on consumer debt, financial regulation, and related issues. So Todd, glad to have you on the program to talk about something new here.
Great to be with you, Richard, as always.
Hey, so thinking about the title of the book, Unprofitable Schooling, and you refer to American higher education as America's broken ivory tower. What does it mean to call it a broken ivory tower? Isn't our country home to fabulous research institutions, some of the best universities in the world? We steer, most of our high school graduates towards higher education. We think that's certainly a measure of success in early adulthood to graduate from a university in America or college. But you're saying we have a broken ivory tower. What do you mean?
Well, what we had in mind in picking that title was, to some extent, the America's higher education system is quite the envy of the world. But there's also a widespread sense, which I think is correct in this case, that to some extent we're running on fumes. That there's the old saying I often hear it attributed to Herbert Stein that if something can't go on forever, it won't. And that's what, when people look at higher education in America today, that's what it looks like. What we seem to have is costs that just keep going up and up and up, quality that doesn't get any better and in many ways is getting worse, whether it's, whatever's going on in the classroom or the restrictions on free speech. What we see is as costs go up, at the same time, we see the number of permanent professors, tenured professors shrinking, being replaced by low-paid adjuncts and visiting professors and that sort of thing. And so we have a sense in which this just can't go on forever. Increasing costs, declining quality. And we picked the title somewhat tongue-in-cheek. The Unprofitable Schooling relates to when the idea for the book first came around was during the Obama administration. And the Obama administration basically had a pretty clear policy program, was more of the same. Which is basically what they decided was that the traditional system didn't have enough money, that we needed to shovel more money into the furnace of the traditional system. We needed to give free community college to everybody else, and at the same time they launched an all-out war basically to destroy for-profit education, which, as the book shows, is in many ways one of the most innovative and important sectors of the American economy and actually training people to do useful jobs. So basically their view was, if it's something you like, you subsidize it. If it's something you don't like, you destroy it. And the only thing they wouldn't allow was laissez-faire, which was try to think about how the system might work if we founded it on the principles of competition and consumer choice, which in every other sector of the American economy have been the driving dynamics that bring down costs and improve quality and customer satisfaction.
Thinking about, you mentioned the Obama administration, if memory serves me correctly, they nationalized the student loan market.
Yes.
I think that was a part of Obamacare, strangely enough, or maybe not strangely. They nationalized it, so in effect, losses for that are incurred by taxpayers or future taxpayers, and universities are kept out of being accountable in any way, shape, or form for student loan indebtedness, meaning if they're actually doing a good job by their students or preparing their students for life as a full-time employee, adult life. So that's one aspect of this, and you talk a lot about that in the book. Conservatives and libertarians, maybe more conservatives, tend to bemoan political correctness, lack of free speech, lack of sort of intellectual diversity on campus. And you guys here in this book are focusing on regulation, governance and incentives for how colleges and universities are run. What do you think, or what do you see are the biggest problems in that area?
And that's exactly right, Richard, which is that there's been dozens of books written over the past few years by libertarian and conservative thinkers bemoaning problems of freedom of speech, the whole problem with the whole Title IX farce and due process, the deterioration of the curriculum, how many, should we be teaching Shakespeare, all that sort of thing. But despite all of that, which I don't need to denigrate because it's important and aspirational, the piece that's been missing is, why does it never actually get implemented? What's going on? What are the governance dynamics that are driving that, both internally and externally? And internally, what we've seen is basically that the trustees who used to run universities are now pure figureheads, and basically the universities have been taken over by the faculty and by the senior administrators, who basically run the universities for their own benefit. We can come back and talk about that more. But then the other factor that we were interested in is, why don't we have more competition? Why don't we have more innovation in higher education? And this is really where the wet blanket of federal regulation comes into play, and the one-size-fits-all model of what education should look like, the accreditation cartel, where that comes from, and all the various systems of regulation that dampen innovation and prevent competition, and basically create a massive cartel that benefits the insiders and passes the bill on the taxpayers and parents.
Thinking about the recent scandal in the news, everyone will have heard of it. Lori Loughlin, also known as Aunt Becky, from her character on Full House. Apparently, I'm told she's going to jail for at least 2 years. If she admits guilt, she's still going to jail for at least 2 years for this. So Lori Loughlin and a number of parents, wealthy parents, paid fees to get their students into schools. Various ways of coaxing people to look the other way and admit their children. One of the graduates of USC, which I think it was Loughlin's, both of her daughters are at USC, Tiana Lowe, a conservative journalist in Washington, graduate of USC, I thought said something very interesting on this. She compared her alma mater to a giant hedge fund. Now, I would have added, as I read that, but hedge funds are ultimately still accountable to their investors. I don't know that USC really is. I agreed with her that it's a hedge fund, and we can talk about that. You've got a beautiful essay from the late Henry Manny on this score of how these seemingly nonprofit institutions actually do dole out profits, particularly to their faculty and also to administrative personnel. But thinking about this idea, the unaccountable hedge fund, I think colleges and universities seem to be the only institutions who don't have any skin in the game. Students do in the form of debt and time. Parents do in the form of debt that they're taking on. Taxpayers to some extent do. We could go on. I'm sure there's a longer list here, but colleges themselves don't, it seems to me. So it seems to be crucial here in reforming these governance issues is to make colleges accountable. But how do we do that?
And I think that, one of the things about this whole college admission scandals is this idea that we don't, that there's this limited oversight of these universities because they're nonprofit, right? Because they're nonprofit, they're not greedy. It's the most outrageous, it's the most naive, it's the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard. I've never heard a college president say, well, I think we've got enough money. How about if people give their money to some other worthwhile charity this year, right? There is so much money sloshing around inside of higher education. The whole system is so corrupt. And as you said, the problem is there's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in this system, basically with no accountability. And the reason is that basically people just want to kind of put on these, ivy-colored blinders and pretend like these universities aren't just giant economic enterprises, which is what they've become. And Henry Manny's essay is one of my favorites in the book also, which is actually a reprint of an essay that Henry wrote a year or so before he passed away, one of the last articles he ever wrote. And I wanted to republish it in this book because it was published online and I didn't want to be lost to history. And His point is all higher education is for-profit education, which is that everybody's trying, all these universities, all they're trying to do is they're trying to make money. They're trying to bring in as much money as they can. They're competing, but they're competing in this totally weird market where you don't pay out anything to shareholders. So who gets the benefits? It goes to the professors, who nowadays are working less, teaching less, and getting paid ever more. It goes to these administrators who just replicate themselves like kudzu. I like to joke that one administrator works, two administrators hold meetings and hire a third person to do the work.
Yeah.
And it's basically, so rather than paying out the shareholders, you just pay it out to these insiders in the system, professors and the like. And what we've really managed to do is recreate the American healthcare system by basically moving to a system of third-party payer, where people don't basically have to pay for it themselves because there's so many subsidies directly and indirectly built into the system that it breaks down all the accountability from consumers. And because of this laughable notion that these colleges are pure because they call themselves nonprofit, that we don't have to provide supervision for how they're spending trillions of dollars of money, I think is ridiculous. And I think one of the things that a lot of the public is kind of waking up to after this college scandal is how greedy and corrupt these institutions really are, absolutely to the core. And it really does go to this question of massive amounts of money, massive amounts of entitlement, and no accountability for those inside the walls.
Now, just on this theme, things could get worse, obviously. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, your old friend, now presidential candidate for the Democratic nomination, has put forward a proposal that I think virtually 80% of student loan debt, which I think totals $1.5 trillion, would just be wiped off the books by the federal government. So
right.
If thinking about colleges putting skin in the game, that actually means they get further away from the game and remain wealthy spectators. Watching all of us struggle to put our kids through college here. So just some data you've got opening of the book, and I just wanted to share that with the listeners. Inflation adjusted tuition at four-year colleges has tripled over the past 30 years. 6-year completion rate for 4- and 2-year programs is only 54.8%. You also have data about those who do graduate from college with a bachelor's degree. Only, I think, something like 31% can actually complete document literacy tests, meaning they understand a tax form, a food label, or a news article. That struck me as its own indictment. The time spent studying has gone way down, 13 hours per week in 2003 per student. All these sorts of things, in my mind, supporting the view this isn't really education. This is, call it what you want, signaling from a student to a future employer that you actually have put through 4 years of education. You could do that sort of work. But when one contrasts that with prior experiences, you're a graduate of Dartmouth. One thinks of Dartmouth 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. The type of education one would receive, the rigor employed. Obviously, I think it would be hard to argue that it's been maintained or even increased. So we've got an industry, we've got a mechanism of shuttling young people through, and in some way giving them some sort of a merit badge. But the quality of the merit badge seems to be lessening, and people may be understanding that fact, which seems to be crucial because right now the only thing challenging the universities, I think, would be for the demand curve to just fall off.
Yeah, and in other sectors of the economy, what checks this sort of problem, right, of inferior goods and high cost is competition. And what we have created in the United States is a massive cartel. Universities rarely fail. Universities rarely get they don't lose accreditation just because they're bad, right? There's all these schools with terrible results that never lose accreditation or anything like that. And that was one of the things I think was interesting. One of the things we look at a lot in the book is the history of higher education, and in particular, what did higher education in America look like before this gusher of money spilled into it from the federal government, and what impact did all that have? And what we saw was 19th century, for example. Rich Vedder has an article on education before the Morrill Act, and it turns out things that were valuable to people paid for. We had plenty of engineers, we had plenty of lawyers, we had plenty of doctors.
So in the history, there's some important points of departure. The Morrill Act being one of them. Talk about that briefly. What it was and what.
Yeah, the Morrill Act was the first major government intervention into higher education, which created the land grant college system. And most people have this sort of gauzy-eyed view about how great it was to create, what a revolutionary effect it was to create the land grant college system. Well, when Rich Vedder looks at it, it's a lot more ambiguous as to what impact it had. That first, there was a lot of people doing those things already, right? It's not clear that it increased it. What it did do was provide a lot of political chum by basically giving money to all the different states to create universities and that sort of thing. But it's not clear what a direct impact it had. But really, and so the question is, why is competition lacking in this market? And what everybody recognizes is that it's the accreditation system. And this basically government-sponsored cartel where the incumbent businesses get to decide who's going to compete and how they're going to compete. Now, how did that come about? Well, Josh Hall has a terrific chapter, one of my favorite chapters in the book, where he looks at and why that matters is because accreditation is now the gateway. You have to be accredited in order to get federal funding. And the way the system is set up now, without federal funding, it's very difficult to compete in this market, except in very specialized sorts of ways. So how did that come about? Well, what Josh notes is that it really came about because of the GI Bill. Well-intentioned, but it became sort of the tail that wags the dog, which is after World War II, they gave money to the GI Bill, and it turns out a lot of soldiers used that to go get an education. A lot of soldiers, though, just used it to get a degree, which is to say, actually going to school is hard. So there were plenty of universities there who were perfectly willing to just give you the degree without giving you the education. And so these diploma mills sprung up. And so then when they reauthorized the GI Bill after the Korean War, they said basically we need to make sure the money is going to legitimate universities and not to these diploma mills. And they said, how are we going to determine what's a legitimate university? And they said, there's this accreditation system sitting around over here. We'll make those guys the ones who determine what is a real university, and in order to be a real university, in order to get money. And that little increment, and again, it comes back to the main point, which is when people were spending their own money, they made sure they were getting an education. When people were spending somebody else's money, there was if they just wanted a degree and the value of a degree, they just get a degree. They wouldn't go through the trouble of it, right? And it's only once you break the link between what people are paying for and what they're getting that you end up with this particular problem. And once you open up that hydrant of federal money, then sort of most of the problems we have now flow from that. It's estimated, for example, that for every Dan Polsby has an essay in the book that talks about this, that for every dollar of increased federal financial support, 65 cents goes into the pockets of the universities in higher costs. And where is that money going? As we talk about in the chapter I co-authored with Chris Koopman, that money is not going to the classroom. That money is not going into improving education quality. It's going to this army of bureaucrats that have grown so much faster than classroom instruction. It's going to these fabulous palatial buildings and rec centers and
lazy rivers.
The latest thing for many universities are lazy rivers. I was just looking. Louisiana State University has a lazy river that's actually shaped in the letters LSU, and it's just bread and circuses, right? And so, meanwhile, the percentage of tenured and tenure track faculty has fallen. balance the books, basically, the universities are replacing them with low-paid adjunct and visiting professors. Meanwhile, the money's going to parties, and it's going to lazy rivers and bureaucrats,
not education,
but not education, and so, what are we getting for our money?
Well, so I guess one conclusion would be people really don't understand this. Or maybe they do, maybe students do, when they go visit, say, in the spring of their junior year or the fall of their junior year. They like this stuff. They see it and they're enticed by it, not at all thinking about this huge amount of indebtedness they're going to incur tied to that. Another thing, it seems to me is, and this, this argument with regards to healthcare has not worked. There seems to be, people have made this argument numerous times about the link between consumers and spending and choices and healthcare costs being so high. And, why does it cost so much to do this for this simple operation or something like that? And there's just really no takers for the argument. And so at one level, it's just sort of as if Americans really do want this until maybe they don't, until as you open the podcast by saying, nothing that can't go on forever will. Thinking also with this idea around student loans, because I take it those aren't going away. It seems to me. Now, higher education would implode if they were taken away. But what about something like making universities, colleges, putting them on the hook for partial repayment if such and such percentage of their students actually don't enter into full-time work? The monitoring, that would be the challenge, but it could be done, I think. What if such and such percentage of their students go on welfare benefits after graduation for a while? Then they actually have to start to repay some of this because, they're really not an attractive feature of this public argument we all make, which is you got to go to college to get a job.
Yeah, well, one thing we don't tackle very much in the book, to the extent that I've decided now I have to write another article or maybe even a book, is the question of student loans and a lot of those cost issues. And so I've been looking at that data, even though it's not presented in the book. And here's the interesting thing about it is that that what we think we know about student loans doesn't obviously always seem to be the case. So, for example, it turns out when one looks at the data, the primary driver, the primary correlates of default on student loan are actually demographic, which is to say that if you're an older student, if you have kids, if you're on your own when you go to college, if you're male, minorities, if you're from a lower income background, those are the primary predictors as to whether or not you default on your student loans. The other thing that matters is whether or not you complete your degree. And of course, that's correlated with the first thing. But one obvious, easy policy solution is stop encouraging kids to go to college who aren't going to finish their degrees. And the reason why they end up defaulting is that basically you go to college, you get the debt, but as you mentioned signaling earlier, Richard, is that if you get the debt, but a lot of the value is in the degree. It's actually, as Brian Kaplan jokes, the most valuable investment you'll ever make in your life is just going to the fourth year of college. Yeah. The first 3 years of college don't benefit you at all financially. It's only once you get the sheepskin, right? So and so it turns out then. So for example, there's an inverse correlation between how much debt somebody has and whether they default or not, which is to say the default rates are highest for students who have less than $5,000 of debt and lowest for students who have more than $40,000 of debt. Why is that? Well, it turns out if you go to a selective school, you complete your degree, you're likely to get a good job if you want it nowadays. If you go to a bad school, or a community college and you drop out, then you're not going to get a good job. And so a lot of these, and so what I think the problem is that if what's driving this is primarily demographics, who you are, rather than what you major in or those sorts of things, which seems to be the data, while it seems like a logical idea to hold the universities responsible and think that will respond basically by improving the quality of education, once you understand how greedy and self-interested these universities are, I'm afraid that what they would actually do is just stop taking kids who are from low-income backgrounds, kids who are from who are alternative students and that sort of thing, just basically because that's the path of least resistance. And I think if you want to predict how universities will respond to any set of incentives, try to think of sort of the slimiest private business you can think of, and however they would do it, and that's probably how most universities will respond. And so that would be my concern, and maybe that's okay, right? Maybe we just want to retrench the student loan system. Maybe we only want to make loans to people we think will pay it back. But maybe not. The last thing I'll say on that is that and this is one of the reasons I've gotten interested in it, is it turns out that we've basically created a social welfare system, and we call it a student loan system. Only 37% of student loans are borrowers are current in paying down their debt. The other 63% are either in default or delinquency, simply paying the interest, or not even paying interest, and their debt is getting higher because they're saying an income-based repayment plan, right? And so I think a lot of students have anticipated exactly what Senator Warren is now peddling, which is the idea that someday there's going to be a student loan jubilee, and they're not going to have to pay it off. But when only 37, it's kind of a misnomer to call it a loan if only 37. I mean, subprime mortgages did better than 37% repayment rate.
Yeah. Now, this sparks a question too, though. Why haven't students, parents, savvy employers figured out alternative, cheaper, more efficient signaling mechanisms?
It's a great question, and I think what we see is there's two elements to that. One is a question: what is going on? Why do we have so much degree inflation? Right, credential creep. Right,
okay.
That seems to be being reversed now a bit because the labor markets are so competitive. But what we've seen over time is that jobs that traditionally needed a high school degree now need a college degree, and college degrees need master's degrees. I've not seen any good persuasive theory as to what explains credential creep and why people why people are paying more for more and more education. That's one thing I don't know. But I think the second thing is that there really is this competitive problem, which is that innovators who want to come into the market and try to deliver a high-quality product at a lower price just can't do it because of the accreditation cartel. And you mentioned earlier alternative credentialing systems, things like that. For whatever reason, the traditional college degree holds a particular place in the employment ecosystem. And if we can understand why that is, and we can understand what's been the drivers of this credential creep, I think that would probably be the other part of it.
Well,
you allow more competition and more hiring on the back end.
I mean, one view is, and I think the name of the case is Griggs, U.S. versus Griggs, and I think it was Duke Power Company.
Duke Power versus Griggs.
Duke Power versus Griggs. Sorry, I was thinking maybe the EOC had sued, but. So Duke, like a lot of companies I have read at the time, used IQ tests to try and sort out cognitive capabilities of new employees.
Right. Or just sort of standardized test of skills.
Yeah. And it was interesting. I was thinking the military uses those, but I guess maybe there's a national security exception there. But to sort out employees, and I guess with disparate impact theory, fell disproportionately on minorities. So they tossed that out. One view is colleges sort of stepped in slowly to fill that void. Maybe, I'm sure you had this experience growing up. It was just sort of drilled into you that this was a mark of success to go to college, and you better be there, or you're going to be engaged in some low menial job if you don't. I mean, that was certainly the expectation that I was given, and I suspect it hasn't changed that much. And so it's sort of linked into this whole American middle class rising success thing we purportedly believe in. and how one disentangles that. Well, maybe, debt you can't pay back. 63% of people unable to do so regularly. Maybe that starts to unwind that. I don't know.
Well, and it's come to have a huge outsized economic impact, right? In a lot of small towns, their local, liberal arts college employs hundreds of people, right? And it's basically like an economic development program. I think we shouldn't understate the fact that when there's this much money and you combine it with sort of the role of the universities and the commanding heights of elite establishment opinion formation in the United States, I mean, we should recognize the fact that that higher education is a huge economic force and a political force. When you look at when you look at campaign finance records for Barack Obama, you can do a search that'll identify by the employer's name, right? All the employees who work for a particular employer, they list their employer, right? So it's not the employer PAC, but all the people who work for it. By employer name, the single largest employer of those who donated to Barack Obama was California, Berkeley. Number 3 was Harvard. 6 out of the top 10 donors to Barack Obama's campaign were universities, employees of universities. That's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of economic development, and it's a huge amount of political clout, which they use. And so when Obama was president, they used it to basically strengthen their cartel, to destroy the competitors in the for-profit industry, to increase the subsidies and that sort of thing. And so just like any other industry in which you see barriers to entry, cartelization, and the like, you can look at the political dynamics here, and I think that's an important part of the story that people haven't appreciated, and why everybody knows that online education, for example, should transform higher education. Yet everybody keeps waiting for this to get off the ground, and it doesn't. Everybody keeps recognizing that alternative credentialing should do it, but it doesn't get off the ground. And I think people have underestimated the clout of the cartel and the clout of the incumbents and how much money and political force that they have in basically propping up their position. And I think this could go on for a while. And meanwhile, they're basically extracting it out of parents and students who feel like they have to do this under the current system and basically pay these inflated prices.
So is one response what the Republican Congress did during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, which is to put an endowment tax on colleges and universities.
Right.
And so you if you want to get it less of an activity, tax it. Was that a prudent move, or is that something else?
Well, I've thought a lot about this, and what the only conclusion I've taken away from all this is that everything we would try to do would have unintended consequences, both good and bad. Yeah. Right. And so, I think one of the reasons for the poor governance at universities today is, to some extent, the idea that, William F. Buckley and God and Man at Yale, for example, said, what we really need is we need to get some hard-headed businessmen on these boards, and they'll crack the whip, and they'll make sure these socialists don't take over the universities, right? Well, we got a lot of businessmen on a lot of boards in America, and how's that turned out, right? Well, I think partly what it was is that they didn't understand that the rules of the nonprofit sector are different from the for-profit sector. A university president is not the same as a CEO of a company. A university president does not have a profit and loss statement that says whether or not they're doing a good job, right? They've got all these other diffuse sorts of things. And so what you end up with, I think, is a lot of these business people defer to the university president like they're a CEO, but again, there's no accountability there. And so what I think is instead has happened is that's been one of the things that's catalyzed this massive growth of the administrative apparatus, is empire building by presidents and their staffs and that sort of thing. And so far from checking the faculty, they've basically grown up this separate power system next to the faculty in the universities. That's an unintended consequence. As I said, trying to think about how to reform the student loan system will have unintended consequences. An endowment tax, you could think of a lot of ways that might be good. You could think about problematic aspects of it. I think over the long run, until we retrench the amount of federal money, and with the federal money, the federal regulation, we're just going to kind of be stuck here, and everything else is sort of adjustments around the margin.
Why? I mean,
that's the driving factor, I think.
So why do we not see any efforts? I mean, even accreditation. I mean, as you know, with law schools, my understanding is the Department of Justice allows the American Bar Association to be the accreditor for law schools in America.
Yep. So
that's why you have this, one size mindset with regards to legal education, which makes no sense, it seems to me. No movement on any of this front, which I think could be done from the executive branch to retrench the accreditation cartels. See no movement on anything to tinker even with student loans. It's almost as if there's no real understanding of this by people in power.
Yeah, and I think that the question is, it's a backhanded accreditation. Again, the logic, once you buy the premise, to some extent you buy the bid, right? Which is, if you're going to be shoveling taxpayers' money into these things, if people are going to get things they don't have to pay for, then you do have this problem of diploma mills, and if people spending money on sort of illegitimate type things, which we see a lot of today anyway, right? And so then the question is if you retrench on accreditation, which I think is a good thing, what is going to replace that as a system to try to create more quality, right? Otherwise, you basically end up with the savings and loan system, right? Or, the federal banking system, where you basically have deposit insurance, and you have then a potential for banks to take risks that they don't have to pay for, right? And so that's the catch, that's the rub, which is, as long as we have all this money going into the system, we inevitably run into this problem of enterprising people trying to get their hands on it, and maybe it's at the point where it couldn't get any worse, right? And that's quite possible, right? But that would be my only concern. I would want to think about the system as a whole in terms of trying to reform accreditation, while at the same time dealing with this concern about so much third-party money flowing into it.
Something that the former governor of Indiana, Mitch Daniels, who went on to be the president of Purdue University for a number of years, one of the things he did, I'm forgetting the year, but if you entered as a freshman at Purdue, you graduated as a senior with no increase in your tuition. It was a pretty remarkable thing. He hit on, in a number of op-eds and essays, all of these things we're discussing. I mean, he understood them very well, felt very powerless to do anything about it. Talked about the number of people he had on campus just to handle accreditation, making very nice salaries. One of the things he talked about, and it's an old Milton Friedman idea, is the ability to incorporate yourself and, basically take subscriptions from investors who would receive, future shares of your income as a way of handling and paying for college. If you looked into that, have you thought about that? Is that a way to minimize or compete with the student loan market that might actually be better for all parties?
Yeah, I think that, and that's something I would encourage, right? Which is experimentation, and things like that, right? Which is, I think that's a very clever idea. Trying to figure out how it works over the long run, I think will be challenging, and think about how it scales, I think will be interesting. But certainly, it's basically the idea is selling stock instead of bonds, right? Which is sell an interest in the income you make rather than other things, right? It's easy to implement at Purdue because Purdue graduates engineers who get good jobs and get paid a lot.
Yeah, that's right.
It may not work as well at other schools where you have a lot of...
you can see it being a race to the top, in the sense of the most talented, promising students have no problem financing their education, but there's not much of a market for a broad middle. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
For doing that. And so, but I think certainly where it can be done, I think it's a very innovative idea. And obviously Daniels has been a brilliant university president, a brilliant observer of the system, and I think his tuition freezes, all those sorts of things, seem to have had some bite in the sense that it appears that Purdue's applications and that sort of thing have gone up, and so hopefully that's the beginning of a trend of entrepreneurs trying different things rather than just doing the same old thing that everybody else does.
Yeah. So things could obviously get worse. Attempt, which, I mean, there's no way seemingly to pay for this, but we hear proposals to make free, to make higher education free in America. One can imagine the type of control and what that would do to the diversity in higher education, which seems to me one of the few good things still about American higher education is the diversity of offerings. All of that diversity, though, predates sort of the modern regulatory state. I think we haven't seen a lot of, as you pointed out, a lot of new entrants into the market, but all sorts of ways in which this could get worse, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the problems with accreditation and federal funding and that sort of thing, right, is it tends to push this one-size-fits-all model on all the different universities. And I think that's one of the interesting things about for-profit colleges, and we have a couple of chapters on in the book on for-profit colleges, is when because they provide kind of a case study, and they what would the world look like if it wasn't if it wasn't all part of the system. And so one of the things that I think is very interesting about for-profit colleges, when you step back and you observe the modern higher education system, some of the things just all of a sudden just seem so preposterous. So we talked about lazy rivers, but just think about the fact that these universities have trillions of dollars of real estate, right? They run gymnasiums and what amounts to to sports teams and health centers and all this sort of stuff, right? Why? Why do we have that? Why do they have so much real estate? Why do they have so many buildings? Why are they landlords? Why are they providing food, right? And there's some schools where maybe that makes sense, but it's by no means obvious that should be the system that is designed to cater to most Americans. For-profit colleges, they rent their buildings, right? They expand campuses when if there's a lot of demand. They close campuses when there isn't demand, right? They offer classes that people want. They add new classes. They come up with innovative ways of getting students through faster. Nowadays, one of the reasons it takes those students so long to graduate is they have certain classes they need to take in order to graduate, but they're basically offered whenever the professors feel like it, right? Yeah. So certain classes might not be offered once every 3 years or something like that, right? And so I think, you start looking at this system and how it's set up and to not serve anybody really, except for the administrators and the faculty that populate it. And that's one of the things that leads to then more cost, longer times till graduation, these narrow classes that don't really do anything for anybody. You have these departments that should be long gone, right, where you've got more faculty than students in the departments, but they're kind of stuck in there because of all these archaic rules and that sort of thing that are impressed. And as you said, we've gotten we have a lot more diversity in the sector of the economy that's more that's subject to the forces of competition than we do in this in the so-called nonprofit sector.
As I was thinking about this, it seems pertinent to mention that Roger Miners, one of your authors, mentioned that the University of Phoenix and their Dallas campus asked him to teach a course on economics. He's an economist, and offered him, I think, $1,500 for the course.
Right.
So that seems to me maybe a much more closer market indicator of what academic services, or it seemed that way to him. But just speaking to, I think, the tremendous, the revenue, the dollars, the inflation of services, et cetera, that currently are operating in American higher education. Yeah. Todd Zywicki, thank you so much for joining us to discuss this book you've co-edited with Neal McCluskey, Unprofitable Schooling. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.